Welcome everyone to today's webinar from the Center for Applied Liberal Arts here at NYU SPS. We're going to give it a few minutes for you to filter in, and we'll start shortly. Here we are. I apologize there for a little bit of a technical issue right at the beginning. And we all understand now in this time where we're doing so many things remotely that there can be the occasional challenge. So I hope you can all see the screen now. All right, terrific. Let's get started. Thank you to everyone who's here. Welcome to today's session, New Directions in Translation and Interpreting, Career Flexibility and Remote Work Opportunities. So translation is a fast-growing, diverse, and resilient industry. It offers flexible remote career opportunities for linguists, for project managers, for localization specialists, and for many other career paths that I'm excited to share with you about today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Annelise Finegan Wasmoen. I'm an academic director and clinical assistant professor of translation here at the NYU School of Professional Studies Center for Applied Liberal Arts. In today's session, I am going to first share about exciting developments for the graduate program here at NYU SPS, and then I'm going to introduce a number of different career paths and way to get involved in the language professions for those of you who are NYU alums, those of you who are NYU current students, and of course, the parents of NYU students and alumni. Now, there are many career paths available, and since you've joined this session, I'm going to assume that you're likely a student, an alum, or an NYU parent who knows more than one language and is interested in knowing more about how to leverage that special advanced ability into part or even the whole of your career. So that's what I'll be speaking to today. This is an exciting time to be part of what we call the language professions of translation and interpreting. Not only are language skills in high demand, translation and interpreting, they are fulfilling and engaging professions for those of us, and I suspect it's many of us here today, who enjoy language, who enjoy speaking and writing in multiple languages, and who care about communication across cultures. So first, this afternoon, or it may be evening or even morning, depending on where you're joining us from, let's situate ourselves within what we all share, which is our connection to New York University. So you may be joining today as an alum or a student or an NYU parent from one of the many schools at NYU, from Stern, Steinhardt, Tisch, Tandon, for example. We are at the School of Professional Studies, where our focus is on career preparation and applied education. We're at the Center for Applied Liberal Arts, where we have two master's programs, the Master's in Professional Writing and the Master's in Translation and Interpreting, which I'll be talking about today. We've been around since 2012. We offer a fully online master's program in translation and interpreting, and I'm very happy to represent this program and speak with you today. Now, at NYU SPS, we've actually just developed a new mission statement that I wanted to share with you so that you can have a sense of what our values are here in this community at the Center for Applied Liberal Arts. Here at NYU SPS, our mission is to prepare our students to succeed at all stages of their educational and professional journeys by providing transformative learning steeped in real-world applications while impacting global industries, professions, and communities. And of course, in today's talk, I'll be focusing very much on these global industries, professions, and communities. First, let's do some introductions in the room. I always like to get a sense of who's here. And I'm sure you'd like to get a little bit of a sense of who I am. So for those of you who've come in since the beginning, I'm Annelise Finegan Wasmoen. I'm the academic director and a clinical assistant professor in the MS in Translation and Interpreting. Maybe more of interest to you today is that I'm a translator myself. My work intersects with translation in a number of areas. First, I'm a Chinese to English professional translator. So I'm an award-winning translator. I work with primarily literary translation of fiction, translation of prose, academic translation, and bilingual textbooks. I do a fair amount of bilingual proofreading and editing. If you're a fan of global literature, you may have heard of an author called San Shui, or San Shui, as we say in English, who is a contemporary woman author in China who writes experimental fiction. I've translated many of her books and we've won some awards together. So that's my translation work. In addition, in my academic study, I study translation. So when we talk about translation and interpreting, we usually think of it being in between languages or interlingual. But I'm interested in my academic field in thinking about the relationship between translation and theater. So how does the translation between languages, say, the translation of a script, relate to what we call the intersemiotic translation, or the translation that takes place between the page and the stage. Don't worry though, that's as much as I'm going to tell you about my research field, because I don't want to bore you and we want to talk about career paths that are important to all of you here. So in translation, I have multiple dimensions of it in my career. I'm a translator, I research translation. Most importantly, I teach translation here in this program, along with our wonderful faculty of industry experts and scholars. And I'm joined here by all of you. Now, I was hoping that you could find the polls. We call the question and answer feature here in our system today is called polls. If you wouldn't mind sharing with me where you're joining us from today. I'm here in Manhattan, the Lower East Side near Tompkins Park. I'd be really excited to hear where you're joining us from today. I'll move on in the slides and then come back and check this in just a few minutes. It would be exciting to hear where you're joining us from today. Now, as promised, I'm going to talk first about new directions in translation and interpreting here at the School of Professional Studies in our master's program in translation and interpreting. And then I'll move on to talk about the remote careers and career flexibility that you might be interested in as someone who is multilingual. So, here are a few of the new highlights from our program that I wanted to share from you, and I'm hoping that there are a few alums of our program, actually probably quite a few in the audience here today, who might be excited to hear about this. One is that we are continuing to be fully online. So we have been online since 2012. We understand that many of us are studying in an online form now because of the very terrible and sad circumstances around the global health crisis and the pandemic. With this program, we've been fully online for a while now. We've been doing online degrees since 2012. But we're not a giant online community or a MOOC, they're sometimes called massive online courses. Our courses are capped at 16 students, so in every single one, our students have individual attention. And those of you who are alums know that. You know how you have formed relationships with the faculty through their in-depth feedback on your individual work. Now, this is a new highlight here. Just recently, the New York State Education Department approved us to open up our translation program from Chinese, French, and Spanish into English translation into really any source language translating into English. So, starting this fall, we have students here who are studying Arabic, Farsi, Japanese, Italian, and other languages translating into English. Now, I mentioned that we've been around since 2012, but here at the Center for Applied Liberal Arts at the School for Professional Studies, we're actually building on decades of translation and interpreting education. I'm very proud as someone who is who's been here at NYU for only 3 years to know that the work I do builds on this long tradition here of studying uh, translation and interpreting together. Now, this also is a program that prepares our students for one of the fastest growing professions today. I'll be telling many of you about that in a few minutes about how the profession is growing and how you might get involved in it. We also have full-time or part-time study to fit your schedule. And again, our alums who are here know this. If you're someone who's studying part-time, you can finish up in a matter of just 3 semesters, a year and a half. If you are if you're full-time in 3 semesters, you're a year and a half, part-time in 2 to 5 years. Now, another thing that we do in this program, even though we're online, is we build lifelong connections. Here are some images of our students at their thesis project defenses. So at the thesis project stage, each student undertakes a long translation project of their own choosing. I'll talk in a few minutes about some of the areas you can specialize in translation yourself. And then they defend their work, they justify and explain their decisions in front of a panel of our faculty all together. Now, the connections don't end there though. As you know, many of you are already members of the wonderful Violet Network, that new community we have for alums here at NYU. We have events like this one here today. We also have our current students have career building events where they meet with recruiters from translation and language service providers, or where they network with industry professionals. Just on October 2nd, we had a wonderful networking event, and we had representatives there from TransPerfect, from Morningside, from CEH Translation, all really important translation companies to help our students build those connections in advance. Here are a few notes that I wanted to share with you. Those of you who are alums, those of you who might think about studying at SPS in the future, a few thoughts from our recent students and alumni. One of them who just started the program, and I won't read all of these, just a few select ones, said that all of their classes are interesting and I feel like I'm learning a lot of new useful information about general translation and specific types of translation. Another one of our recent graduates wrote to us to share that less than 1 month after graduation, I got a job as an in-house quality manager translator for a small translation firm. And if it weren't for my degree, I wouldn't be able to take this amazing opportunity. And then down below, we had another recent graduate who said, before I joined the program, I had never had any official training in translation. And now looking back, I am proud to call myself a translator. So these comments are very much, we really work to have a very positive environment for our students in this program. And then in addition, we're proud at the School of Professional Studies to have an above 95% placement rates for our graduates within 6 months after graduation. And we see that to be very much true with this program. And as I'll introduce as we go through today's session, there is really a very strong need for people who are multilingual, who are bilingual, who work across languages in many different industries. So enough about us though. So that was, I wanted to share some highlights for those of you who completed this program and might like to know what's going on these days. And for those of you who are perhaps thinking about this program in the future, as I hope some of you might be. For the rest of our time together, I'm really going to focus on these questions of career flexibility, and remote work opportunities. As I mentioned at the start, I'm assuming if you're here, you're an alum of NYU, you are perhaps a current student, you're a parent of a student or a graduate of this wonderful university, and you're thinking about how you might leverage multilingual skills to become part or even potentially all of your career. In other words, you're interested in joining the language professions. So as part of that, let's go back to our poll participation here. Using the ask button in the polls here, would you mind sharing with us what languages you know? I would be really fascinated to hear this, as I imagine we have a diverse and wide range of languages. Looking back to our poll results from earlier, I see that we have someone here from St. Louis, which is really exciting. I went to graduate school in St. Louis, and I miss it quite a bit, so thank you for sharing that. And we have people from New York as well, like myself. And so right now, please share in the poll what languages you know, and I'll come back and take a look at that in just a few minutes as I'm presenting. So let's say that you know a couple of different languages. Let's say two languages, hypothetically, although I know many of you may know more than that, okay? And you're thinking about going into what we call the language professions. So the first thing you might think about is being a translator or an interpreter. My aim here is to show you how much diversity there is within even these two fields, but let's look first at the most basic level. What is a translator? What is an interpreter? Here's a really helpful breakdown from the American Translators Association. They are the main professional organization for translators and interpreters here in the United States. And they are part also of their international organizations for translation, their regional organizations for translators and interpreters, all things you can get involved with. If you're looking to get involved with a professional organization here in the US, we'd strongly recommend the American Translators Association. So for International Translation Day, which is September 30th each year, celebrated worldwide, it's just passed here a few weeks ago, they provided this infographic on what the difference is between translators and interpreters, because out there in the real world, most of us who are translators and or interpreters know that the terms are used interchangeably. So within the language professions, a translator would usually be someone who works with written text from one language called their source language into another language, their target language. So they might translate books, which I do primarily, contracts. I've done a little bit of that. Many of our students focus on contracts. Websites might not be the first thing you think of, but it's very important. Most people will not buy online products unless the descriptions are available in their own language. So that's very important. So you work from your source language to your target language. What kind of skills might you need to be a translator? Well, you need to have very high comprehension of your source language. So using myself as an example, I studied Chinese for many years. I learned a little bit when I was a child. I studied it formally throughout college, even after college, devoted years of my life to it. And so that's my source language. And then my target language is English. Usually one's target language is the language that you feel most comfortable writing in. How about interpreters? Interpreters work very much in the moment, and they interpret spoken language or also sign language like ASL and other sign languages. So interpreters, where might they work? Well, you can think about a medical appointment. What if it's a situation, and of course this is a very, very live question with the COVID pandemic going on. What if you're somebody who is at a medical appointment and you don't speak the same language as your doctor? You might want an interpreter there. Court proceedings, very important to have interpreters there. And then also at conferences, and I'll talk a little bit about conference interpreting, where there might be people meeting together from different countries, speaking different languages, who need to understand what's going on in real time. And that's what interpreters do. Now, interpreters in general, prefer to work when they can in the setting where they're interpreting, but sometimes they also interpret remotely. And that's been something that's been growing, of course, during the pandemic situation. Now, what kind of skills might you need to be an interpreter? Interpreters usually go in both directions. So let's say, for example, let's give an example. I'm looking at the languages some of you speak. Let's say Japanese. Someone who is a Japanese English interpreter in most settings would be expected to go back and forth between the two languages. So you need to be an excellent speaker of both languages. You need to have full fluent proficiency in speaking in both languages, and be able to also be an excellent note taker and have excellent comprehension of the spoken language so that you can understand what's being said and almost instantaneously reproduce it in the other language. And if things are being spoken rapidly, or if it's a speaker who's doing what I'm doing right now, which isn't pausing very much, then they might even need to listen and speak at the same time, or to take notes and then to speak later and use the notes to keep track of what's been said. Now, I'm looking here in our chat. Oh, and I see I have a wonderful question that's come in. What about films and videos for translators and interpreters? What about translating these materials? I'll actually be talking about that in just a few minutes. I'm so glad you've asked about what we call audiovisual translation. And let's take a look too, and we'll go back to this question here at some of your languages. So I shared that I'm a translator from Chinese into English. I also read Latin, although that doesn't come in very useful in my day-to-day translating experience. And I also speak some German, but I'll be honest, not well enough to do translation or interpreting in that language. So my primary language pair for translation is Chinese to English. I also have some Latin and German. Now among you, this is really fascinating. We have people here in today's meeting who speak and read and know Italian, Spanish, Japanese, English, Hindi, Urdu, Sanskrit, French, some German, like me, and Hebrew. So that's really terrific to know. And that type of diversity, that type of range of languages is actually very similar to what we have in our program here at the School of Professional Studies. So I had talked about translators and interpreters as being these two broad categories where you might like to work as a language professional, or where you're if you're an NYU parent, where your child, where your student who's graduated might be interested in working in the future. So it's these two broad categories. For translators, generally translators tend to be people who, most of us have a bit of a preference between writing and speaking. Translators tend to be excellent writers. Interpreters tend to be excellent, extraordinarily good speakers, and have excellent in the moment decision-making skills and note-taking ability. So you might think yourself about, are you more comfortable in writing? Do you prefer to sit down and think out what you're going to say, write it down, and then present it that way? Or do you prefer to speak verbally in the moment? That might help you decide which of these two paths might be better for you. But translation and interpreting are much more than that, because most translators or interpreters specialize in a small handful of areas. I shared with you at the beginning that I focus in literature. I do some work in media. I do a little bit of work in the sciences. And I also have quite a bit of textbook experience as well. But translators can specialize in all of these areas, such as law or finance, journalism, subtitling and dubbing, and also the translation of websites and software. For interpreters, there are again a myriad of areas where their skills can be put to good use. So for example, there's legal and court interpreters. It's incredibly important, whether it be civil cases, criminal, immigration hearings, all types of settings where really top-notch interpreters are needed. Conference interpreting, very important. It's how international business gets done. And there are different types of community events and services that you can think about, where where it might be helpful to have an interpreter. You notice that many of these pandemic-related news briefings, there might be an ASL, or an American Sign Language interpreter, who's there on camera as well. Very important. Interpreters work in the modes, and I won't go into too much detail here, but in general, in community events and services, they do what's called consecutive interpreting, where someone first speaks and then pauses, and then the interpreter interprets what they've said. When working for government organizations, though, and for organizations like the United Nations, which is one of the largest employers of translators and interpreters in the world, interpreters might be called upon to do what's called simultaneous interpretation, which is extraordinarily difficult. And what you're doing there is you're working from somebody speaking continuously, you let them start and you listen, and then you start interpreting. So you're listening and you're interpreting out loud at the same time. So that takes a lot of training and skill, but interpreting at community events and services, interpreting at business meetings, things like that are a great place to start out with your training. Hospitals, of course, very important to have medical interpreters in all types of hospital settings. For example, a recent example I heard of from one of my colleagues was that they had been live interpreting remotely a birth. You don't think about it, but it was a situation where you needed someone to be able to translate between the doctor and the patient, and so they were on the phone, remote interpreting throughout that very special experience. And schools too are another wonderful place for interpreting. Some of our students in this program volunteer at parent-teacher conferences in order to help facilitate communication there. Now, even beyond that diversity within translation and interpreting, we have a variety of other multilingual careers that I wanted to share with you as alternatives to being a translator or an interpreter, or something you might do to supplement your work as a translator or an interpreter. These are all ways to leverage your language skills. And this sampling I'm providing here isn't meant to overwhelm you, but rather to help you see how your particular skills, your special strengths could be put to use. So you might think about working as a localization expert or a localization specialist, helping a company to tailor their content and tailor their product and tailor their public-facing messages to a particular cultural and linguistic environment. You might think about, if you're a strong writer and editor, you might think about being a proofreader or a bilingual editor. That's one area where I got my own start in translation, was editing bilingual texts. Project management is very important. So you might think about, with large language service providers who provide translation service, they need people to keep track of, it might be a company translating their website into a dozen languages, or it might be as simple as one small task where you need to find a translator in a lesser spoken language. Uh, Keeping track of large scale projects, keeping track of small scale projects, project management is very important. And a lot of our students go into this area. Quality assessment, so quite simply checking that translators have gotten their work right. This is a really important area. Post-editing machine translation. Now, I'm sure somebody here will ask, isn't machine translation going to make human translation and interpreting obsolete, right? Aren't we not going to be able to have careers in this area because Google Translate or Sogo, Fangyi, or other types of translation engines have gotten so good? Well, actually, they've gotten very good at widely spoken languages in content that's very standardized, but you don't have to push too far to find examples of machine translation gone very poorly. And if you would like to see a fun example, you might look up the YouTube channel called Google Translate Sings, where it's a performer who translates things into Google Translate in various languages back into English, and then she translates song lyrics and then performs the songs with the usually nonsense that comes back out. So there's a real need for translators, people trained with with really excellent skills in both languages to check, or what we call post-edit, the output of machine translation, and also pre-edit the content that goes into machine translation. That's a really exciting career path. It's something that we actually have a course in here in this master's program. You might work for a large language service provider. You might start your own translation business. You might be a linguist. Now, a linguist is sometimes used as synonymous with a translator or an interpreter, but in military settings, in government settings, linguists are also in high demand. You could, of course, teach languages. Most of us who study a language as an adult know and value very much how wonderful our teachers were. So this is just a sampling, and then I'll go into a few illustrations here. But first, I wanted to share with you the career outlook for language services. Oh, and I'm just checking the chat here quickly, and I see that we have some other Chinese speakers here, which is wonderful. And also viewers from the West Coast, in addition to the East Coast and St. Louis, sort of in the middle of the country, from Oakland, California. And our viewer from St. Louis went to KU. Oh, terrific. Um, so the career outlook for language services, I wanted to share with you some facts and figures. Don't worry, this is the only facts and figures slide, but just to demonstrate to you how good this market is. So the Common Sense Advisory Research Language Services Market, and this is their most recent report last year, project the global market for outsourced language services to reach almost 50 billion in 2019. So that's 60% translation, again, written translation, 15% spoken interpreting, and 24% related services, including localization, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, and post-editing. In addition, translating was one of LinkedIn's top 10 most in-demand hard skills that companies are seeking. What does that mean? It means that when companies are going to LinkedIn and looking for skills for potential employees, they're looking for translation as one of those areas. So if you're able to build up a little bit of expertise in translation, get a little bit of experience under your belt, put it on your resume, put your languages on your resume, because there are, and in your LinkedIn profile, of course, because there are employers and companies out there who are looking for this and looking for it very often. One of the top 10 most searched for hard skills companies we're looking for on LinkedIn recently. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics projects growth of much faster than average for translators and interpreters, much faster than other career paths, 18% over a 10-year period from 2016 to 2026. And then finally, of course, one thing that we're all thinking about in our context today is what is the impact of the economic shutdowns and slowdowns that have come along with, again, this terrible humanitarian and medical crisis that we are all living through with COVID-19. So translation has been a really resilient industry, and particularly in the areas you might think of: scientific, medical, technological, life sciences. Those areas are really very strong, but then also areas that you might not think of at first, but then they sort of make sense. So translation of audiovisual content, subtitling and dubbing for movies, and for video games, localizing video games, because many of us are at home, are isolated, are looking to these types of online content providers like Netflix, Amazon Prime, the BBC, to help keep us entertained at this time. So that area is also very strong. In short, the Association of Translation Companies just last month released a coronavirus pulse survey, and that found that 85% of the language service companies that they surveyed said that they were seeing signs of recovery in the language services industry. So I think that's a very positive indication of where we'll be going. Now, I mentioned this was the only fact and figure slides. It'll be mostly picture slides from here on out, because I want to share with you some wonderful examples. So we've talked about translation and interpreting as areas where you can leverage your multilingual skills and where you can really put to use that diverse and special and unique language background that each of you has who's here today. Translation and interpreting and the related language professions are also a great way to take control of your career because, in addition to full time in house positions with large language service providers like TransPerfect or like Morningside or Lionbridge, or with big corporations like law firms or Microsoft or Google, many language professionals are self employed or own smaller translation companies. And here's another graphic from the American Translators Association talking about some of those advantages. Now, if you're somebody who would prefer to work at home, who enjoys working remotely, who perhaps only wants to work part-time or wants to work full-time but have control over your hours, or control even over where you live while you work. Translation in particular can be a really good option for you. As this graphic notes, most translators and interpreters are self-employed freelancers. They contract with language companies, they work directly with clients, they work directly with the individuals who need their services. And as one of our faculty members, Jean Campbell, reminded me recently, if you become a translator, you will never be bored because every project you do is going to be different. So freelance work has these benefits pointed out here. You have the ability to work remotely. You have flexibility to be with your family. You also have the freedom to set rates and income goals. At the same time, of course, as someone who has supported myself as a freelancer, I did that for a number of years between my undergraduate, I went to Yale University, and graduate school at Washington University in St. Louis. In between, for me, it was about 8 years. And for a large portion of that time, I supported myself as a freelancer. And it is challenging in good ways. You might think about it as you don't have a boss, but all the things that your boss might do, you have to do. So things like setting your rates, invoicing, tracking down payments, all of these things you need to do yourself and make sure that you're asking rates for your translation work that support you while you do those things. Oh, we see someone here too joining us, someone new joining us from the Florida Panhandle on the beautiful Emerald Gulf Coast. Okay, now I'm jealous. But thank you for sharing that. Please chime in the rest of you with where you're joining us from. Um, so in short, the control of your career you have with translation interpreting is very high. There are full-time opportunities, but about 70% of the translators and interpreters in the United States do some or all of their work on a freelance or contract or self-employment basis. Many start their own companies, and sometimes they end up growing and subcontracting to others around them and develop into a language service provider themselves. The American Translators Association surveyed translators and interpreters across the country recently, and they found that they average between $45 and $52 an hour for that self-employment work. Now, you might be wondering, what are some ways for me to get involved in the language professions as somebody who is multilingual? Now, of course, you might attend a master's program like the one we have here and study to be a translator. That's one path. But there also, and I'll spend the rest of my time with you today on this topic, um, many other ways to get involved, actions you can take to get involved with the language professions and start to build out your career profile in this area. The first one is to think about where you might volunteer and think about volunteering. I wanted to start with, of course, this very topical opportunity and challenge that we have, and share with you a little bit from Wired Magazine's recent article titled COVID-19 is History's Biggest Translation Challenge. Now, this article points out that if we want to avoid a pandemic spreading to all the humans in the world, the information about it has to reach all the humans of the world, and that's something to the tune of 7,000 languages. And that means translating PSAs into as many languages as possible in ways that are both accurate and culturally appropriate. So this article reminds us that for over half of the world's population, people can't just Google their symptoms and say, I have this fever and I have maybe this loss of smell or this difficulty breathing or this cough. So it's what the WHO calls an infodemic. An infodemic that we also saw after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti and the Ebola epidemics in Western Africa and more recently in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So you might think about, there was a huge project recently getting involved with things like this that was just to translate the 5 WHO guidelines into more than 220 languages to put on posters. So the guidelines to wash your hands frequently, to cough into your elbow, to socially distance appropriately, to stay at home whenever possible, and of course to wear a mask. These guidelines were translated into posters and also a Mythbuster fact sheet. And I hope that you might check out this article, as one of you just said you would. It's so true about the infodemic. So in addition to this article, I wanted to mention a few specific organizations you might think of. The Endangered Languages Project has been working very actively on COVID-19 PSAs, as has Translators Without Borders. You may have heard of Doctors Without Borders. There's also an organization called Translators Without Borders that really focuses on getting information in local languages when there's a need for humanitarian and for medical relief. There's a group called the TAUS, T-A-U-S, Language Data Network. They actually work with machine translation and with giant bodies of translated text that are used. They're called corpora or corpuses to train machine translation. They gathered a whole bunch of those having to do with COVID-19 in different languages and made them publicly available to help translators who are translating messages, documents, scientific trial studies, PSAs having to do with COVID so that they could use accurate terminology. There's also the microlender Kiva, Kiva. They are always looking for translators. It's a great way to get started with volunteer translation because they're usually small projects that you can do in just a couple of hours. Other examples are students have volunteered with parent-teacher conferences in schools in the New York City area. They've also interned with legal services in New Jersey and other places across the country to help support people who speak English as a second language or who might not speak English at all, who need support in navigating whether it's the immigration and naturalization system or other similar areas. Now, of course, volunteering is only one area that you might think about. Another thing to think about is about terminology. So I'm going to share with you this quote from one of our faculty members, Barbara Inge Karsh. Companies that are serious about their linguistic presentation and professional image put work into naming their products, features, departments, job titles, and most of all, the company itself. As their extended representative, translators must put equal care into the coining of new terms and names. So Barbara works in this fascinating area of the language professions called terminology, where you think about concepts, what they should be called, and what they should be called across multiple languages. One of my favorite examples of this is that Barbara has shared is when the device that we call a thumb drive or a flash drive first came out, there were massive debates within companies like Microsoft about what do we call this thing? Do we call it a flash drive? Do we call it a thumb drive? How do we translate that into the over 100 languages where we market our products and where our products reach? So terminologists think very much about these questions. I wanted to share with you Barbara's quote so that you could think about where you're situated if you're employed currently. You might point out where it could be more precise in their terminology, or where could the company where you work be more culturally adept in its messaging or reach a new audience by translating or localizing its content? So a frequent path into careers as translators and interpreters comes from being useful like this in the workplace, spreading around the languages you know, letting people know you know these languages, and that's where you get your first experience. We put it in the profession as saying that many of us fall into becoming translators or interpreters. That's what happened with me. I worked for a publisher who knew that I knew Chinese. They asked if I would help with contracts. They asked if I could help with editing translations, and then they asked if I could translate for them. Now, of course, it's also a common experience that once we try this out in the workplace, we realize how difficult translating and interpreting can be, but it's all about gaining experience, and each time you translate something it gets easier. And we also have, there's this master's programs, there are other master's programs that can really help you to specialize and develop those skills quickly. You can also learn them on the job. Another tip as you're thinking about getting involved in the language professions is to use technology. And here's a quote from another faculty member, Tom Allwood, saying, just like learning a language, once you learn how to use a tool, it makes learning additional tools that much easier. Don't go in resenting technology. See it as a necessary professional skill you need to master. And that's relevant, of course, to what I was saying before about machine translation. There are also computer-assisted translation tools and translation management systems. Really dive in. Some of the computer-assisted translation tools, like Omega T is one, MemSource is another. They're available in web-based formats really for anyone to use. So if you're getting some experience on the job translating, don't be afraid to try and use a tool like a CAT tool to make your process more efficient and more rigorous. Next, be creative with language. This is a quote from Albert Camus. This is a book of his it's actually a lecture that was recently translated by Sandra Smith. And I wanted to share one of the quotes from her translation with you. This is talking about artists, but it can apply also to translators um, in a time of crisis. Our sole justification, if one exists, is to speak out as best we can for those who cannot. The moment that remaining detached was considered a choice and punished or praised as such, artists, whether they liked it or not, became involved. So Sandra works in the field of literary translation. That's where I do quite a bit of my own work as well. You might be interested in this area as a way to support diverse and global representation of authors in the languages that you speak. And those translations that you can produce might come to be used in school curricula. It might be one of those books that a university like NYU chooses for its students to read together. It might increase diversity in publishing. So if you have an author that you care about, whose work you think is fascinating, but it's not available in your target language, it is available in your source language, you might translate excerpts of it, send it out to magazines, to journals, and so on, and get into literary translation that way. And then another thing to think about, and we had a question about this earlier, was about audio-visual translation and new modalities. So usually we think about translation as being text, but this is Annelise Salati, who is a faculty member here, about teaching our audio-visual translation course. And I wanted to share this quote from her to give you a sense of how diverse this can be. So she writes that I present audiovisual translation as a distinctive, constantly changing field in translation, including subtitling, dubbing, voiceover and lip sync, subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, or SDH, and audio description for the blind and partially sighted, game localization, surtitling, respeaking, and 3D subtitling. Now, I won't go into each of these areas because I would like to get to your questions here at the end, but just think about some of these areas that you might not have thought of before, and how much of a need there is for translators to work in these areas. If you're interested in checking out something fun too, I recommend there's a movie called Being George Clooney, where it's a movie that looks at 10 dubbing artists who play George Clooney in their respective languages. languages. It's really fascinating. Um, and as I mentioned briefly before, audiovisual translation is one of the fastest growing and most resilient sectors right now in translation. Again, because so much of us are isolated at home, devouring online content, or even more likely playing video games, and those need to be translated too. So, in closing here, I wanted to tell you a little bit about localization and just give a fun and easy example of why it's important. So, globalization, and I'm drawing here from some wonderful materials provided by the Globalization and Localization Association, or GALA, another group you might get involved in as you're starting out in your career. So, globalization as a process within the language industry means the range of processes to prepare and launch projects and products and activities internationally. Might be multilingual communication, global readiness of those projects and products and services, policies related to international trade and commerce, and so on. So first, you as a large company, you might think about globalizing. Then you think about localizing. That's the process of adapting a product or content to a specific locale or market. So in addition to translation, this might involve modifying the content to suit the tastes or the consumption habits of other markets, adapting design and layout, converting to local requirements using the local form of dates and addresses, and also, and this is the example I wanted to give, adapting graphics to target markets. So think a little bit about these emojis up on the screen. Can you think of an example of one or more of these that might mean something different in different cultures? um, Clint Chung, who's the CEO of iGlobe Advisory, recently wrote a wonderful article on this topic, sharing something I didn't know, which is that the two most popular emojis are the red heart, which I would have expected, but then also the face with tears of joy. It's the fourth from the left on the top row here, which I always think of the laughing until you're crying emoji, that those are among the most popular. But what Clint also points out is that different emojis are more popular in different cultures, and that's something you need to be aware of when you're localizing content that includes emojis. So French users use the heart a lot, he writes. Arabic speakers use the flowers or plant emojis. Americans are the biggest users globally of the LGBT Q emojis. And then in addition, he gives an example of where you need to be careful about emojis, which is all of these hand gestures you see in the middle of the page here. Now, we might think of thumbs up or a hand wave or an okay sign or even the horn sign with the index finger and the pinky as meaning rock out, or these are all positive things we think of in United States culture. Thumbs up, waving a hand to a friend, an okay sign, well, that has some negative connotations too, but and also the horn sign. But in many cultures, these can be as offensive as the middle finger or have meanings that are insulting to the person on the receiving end. So that's why localization is so important. The example I'm giving is with graphics, but you can imagine how this would apply um, to all different types of words and messages. And you can also think of the broader level of transcreation, where you're thinking about marketing messages like Nike's "Just Do It" or McDonald's "I'm loving it." How hard would that be to translate into the other languages that you know? But fascinating, and fascinating work to do. Now, in conclusion here, I'd like to take any questions that you have in our last 10 minutes together. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and enter them in that polls ask feature that you can see on your screen there. And also, as you're asking questions and as we're finishing up today, I wanted to also ask you to do this exercise, whether now, if you'd like to put your answer in the ask, you're welcome to. I'd love to read about them. Or you could do this later. But as an exercise, think about what is your language story? So if you're multilingual, and most of you here, whether you're an alum, whether you're a current NYU student, whether you're a parent of an alum or an NYU student, one of our NYU parents, if you know multiple languages, there is a special and unique story that you can harness in your personal life and in your career. So I'd love to hear some of your language stories if there's time, and I'll turn now to the chat to see if there are any questions. Oh, we have some really kind comments here. Oh, yeah. So we have a question from Eva who's asking, what is surtitling? So subtitling is when you put the text underneath in a video. Surtitling is when you put it overhead, above the content. And surtitling tends to be used quite often in opera and in other types of live performance. That's a terrific question, Eva. Oh, Patrick has shared another question. Thank you, Patrick, about can I explain the acronym GALA that I mentioned? Absolutely. Globalization and Localization Association, or Gala, depends on how you pronounce it, potato, potato. But so they are a group that is an industry organization that promotes localization, globalization, the language professions by gathering together professional companies. And importantly for us, they connect those companies with educational institutions that teach translation and interpretation. Their website, they're a not-for-profit, and their website is really useful in terms of having resources that explain the various areas of the language professions that you might be interested in delving into. They have terrific resources. That's a great question. Please keep the questions coming. I'm going to put up here for a moment a thank you and an invitation to, if you have questions for me after viewing this presentation, if you'd like to share with me your language story and your language background, I would be really delighted to hear more about it. If you have any questions about the graduate program I've been telling you about in this presentation, the MS in Translation Interpreting, here is our contact information. Please feel free to reach out and to raise any questions that you have with us, or to set up a time for a conversation. I'm always happy to speak with students, with alums, and with our NYU parents. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in right now, but we do have, I'll do a last call. We have the last minute or two if you have any more questions. And a reminder here at the end to stay connected. Join the Violet Network. It's a terrific way to be in touch with thousands of School of Professional Studies and New York University alumni on this new digital networking platform. I'm on there myself. Please connect with me. You can sign up at the URL here, violetnetwork.nyu.edu/hub/SPS. We hope you'll join us there and communicate with us there. And I'll give one last check before we close today to see if there are any more questions. And if they're not, I just want to say thank you again for your time today. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope you have found this to be engaging and useful material for you. As I have mentioned before, but it's always worth saying again, if you are the sort of person who is interested in languages, who likes writing, who likes communicating, and who cares about communication across cultures and across languages, translation and interpreting is a fulfilling and creative and rewarding career path. I hope that some of you watching today will consider it because that's something that translators and interpreters and other language professionals really share, is the love and the enthusiasm for what they do. So thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Stick around for some of the other sessions.